Hi, everyone. Warm welcome. Thanks for joining. My name is Abhishek Sharma. I'm part of the Nexus team based in San Francisco. Nexus Venture Partners is an early stage VC firm. We are one team distributed between US and India, striving every day to help exceptional founders build product-first companies. And speaking of founders today, we have the pleasure of chatting with five exceptional product-obsessed founders in the Nexus family. We will discuss with them how they have used product as the wedge to grow their business, right from user acquisition, conversion, retention, and expansion. We'll keep the first 60 minutes for discussion, followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. And folks in the audience, you can post your questions in the Q&A box. We will try to pick up as many of them as we can in the 30-minute Q&A session. With that, let's welcome our panelists, the two Ankits, Dan, Tim, and Tanmai. May I ask you to please take a minute each to introduce yourselves and briefly mention what your product does and who the user is. And maybe we can start with Ankit Gupta, if that's okay. Ankit, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Hey, everyone, Abhishek, thanks for having me. I'm Ankit, the CEO and co-founder at Quizziz. At Quizziz, we have built an learning platform where we empower a teacher to create engaging learning experiences for their students. Our platform is centered around giving teachers with the simple tools to create gamified quizzes and interactive lessons, which then give them meaningful instant feedback. We started our journey from US, but now we serve teachers and classrooms in 100+ countries. And I'm really looking forward for the discussion today.
Ankit, Sobti.
Okay, I can go next. Yeah. Hey everyone, my name is Ankit Sobti. I'm one of the founders and the CTO at Postman. So Postman is an API development platform that is now used by more than 15 million developers and more than 500,000 organizations in the world. So we see teams using Postman to collaboratively build and manage their APIs through the entire life cycle of the API itself. So as a part of my role, I lead product engineering and design at Postman. I'm really excited to be here and share some of our learnings while we have built out the product and the company over the last 7 years or so.
Dan.
So my name is Dan. I'm one of the co-founders of FingerprintJS. FingerprintJS is a browser fingerprinting as a service. So what that means is that we create the highest accuracy browser identifier by pulling unique parameters from your device. And most of the problems that we solve stem around different types of fraud and behaviors of people trying to hide who they are and commit bad things on different websites. We're an API-driven business. Started product-led growth from the beginning. Still learning a lot, but happy to share what we've learned so far.
Tim.
Hey everyone, my name is Tim. I'm the CEO at Apollo. Apollo is a intelligent sales and marketing platform for B2B companies. So we've built a database of 200 million business contacts, and we help sales and marketing teams identify their most likely potential next customers and reach out to them with the best message at the right time. I think we transitioned mostly from a sales-led company to a product-led company in our history. And I think right now we have about 1 million sales professionals using us, 10,000 customers, and still on our product-led journey, and excited to learn from others and share our story as well.
Tanmai.
Hey folks, thanks for having me. I'm Tanmai. I'm the CEO co-founder at Hasura. Hasura is an open source cloud infrastructure company. We can make data access easy for developers so that people can kind of get value from their data much faster because of getting kind of data APIs that allow them to kind of build modern applications easily. We started off with our open source project and then layered on a managed cloud solution and an enterprise offering on top of that after about the first year, the first 1.5 years of the open source project. We grew from about 1 million downloads in our first year to about 400 million downloads today. And we've seen traction in all kinds of companies across all kinds of verticals. So it's been a great journey, and excited to kind of share whatever insights I can with all of y'all.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I'm super excited for the discussion. There's a lot of ground to cover. We probably won't get to all, but also counting on audience questions at the end. So let's get started. So my first question, there are several founders in the audience who are just embarking upon their startup journey, and I commonly hear something like, "We can build the product, but how to attract a massive user base, how to bring a tsunami of users." My question is, as you guys look back and reflect on your 0 to 1 phase in very early days, when we were launching the product, how did you go about lead and user acquisition? What went right? What worked for you guys?
I'll start. Okay.
Sure.
Yeah. So from Postman's journey, right? Like I think every time I have retrospective on this question, right, it's always come down to a few key factors. So let me start with the first and probably the most important one. That it was a product built out of need. Postman, right? It was something that was built like by developers for developers and fundamentally just spread through word of mouth to a large extent because what we had was something that was useful for us, and when we shared it with others around us, it was useful for them. It was solving a genuine need that people had within the ecosystem, and I think that is the most organic reason why we saw people, just using the product a lot and actually talking about it, right? And as a result, we saw this layers of advocacy that happened within for Postman. Advocacy that happened from individuals who just go to their team members and tell them about, hey, I'm using this thing. Have you used it before? Advocacy that eventually happened from influencers because people were often talking about, just, okay, this is what I'm using. It'll be popped up on some of these lists, and we just maintained like good relations with the people. We actually proactively went out and reached out to them every time somebody mentioned us somewhere in one of these lists itself. And interestingly, like as the product started to grow, we also started looking at productizing some of these behaviors. We built like this one thing called the run and postman button, which basically would, there are like a million of those buttons out there now. But when we started, it was a very simple idea that you can take this entity from Postman and you can deploy it everywhere. And then we started seeing it across the board. We had Microsoft APIs filled with those. We had Square APIs filled with those. So like that thing really, really started. So I think to a large extent, a lot of it was, by having a product that was very useful, that solved a genuine need, by focusing on product market fit, not necessarily so much on, growth as such, and shipping very, very quickly and engaging and building with the community around it was a key factor for us.
Yeah, I would actually just add on, I think a lot of things which Ankit said. We saw a similar journey for us at Quizziz. One thing though I would add for us also, there were a lot of iterations. And one thing I feel, end of the day, if you get that product right, your users themselves become your promoter and they do all the marketing, they bring their friends. In our case, I would say we didn't start from Quizziz as a starting product. There was an iteration, and what really helped was that we were listening very closely to our users. There were some signs which we got when we were working on our first product, which then helped us pivot to Quizziz. But post that, we, again, as Ankit said, right, we were, especially in the early phases of your product, things are at a nascent stage, and you listen, you then build, and then let the users know who asked for that feature, right? That then makes them feel that we were part of the journey. And, this concept of from a fan to super fan, I think that really helped us, where once, someone says that, hey, I want this, and in a couple of days, if you send them that, it ends up, just changing the equation. So that was like one part which really worked for us. I think, again, a lot of similarity with Postman VC. So inherently with Quizziz on our platform, we don't build any content, but we allow our community to create that content. And once they create that, right, like other community members find it, they adapt it. So that then created that, the whole loop, and that really helped us to, reach from that 0 to 1. But if I have to reflect back and summarize, probably just listening to the users, adapting, and just, making them feel that they're part of the journey was like something which actually worked for us.
For FingerprintJS, it was a little bit different, but similar themes. where we actually started as an open source hobby project. So we solved a generic problem, weren't necessarily trying to solve individual business problems, put it out there, and then started looking and seeing how people were using the technology to inform each of the next stages. So when the project first started, it was Valentin, our CTO, that created it. And he informed version 2 from version 1 and how people were using it. And then once we started the actual business, we had all of the open source users to inform us in what should the first version of the service actually be. And then we've continued that as well. So now we're starting to figure out the next tier, which is what are the next products that we need to build. And we look at what are the free users and the paid users of the open source solution and the paid solution doing. And then from that, learn and try and create a prototype, see if customers are willing to pay for it, and then continue on with the next stages.
Just sort of building on the open source theme that and Dan was talking about again, lots of similarities, I think, in principles to what's been discussed before. Slight differences in our journey were that we, similar to what Ankit was talking about with Postman, we built Hasura internally to solve kind of our own need when we realized that the solution is mature enough and will be useful to other developers across the world too. Open source and the open source aspect, and importantly, an open source aspect in a community that was vocal and growing, especially for us, it was the GraphQL community. Those are very important vectors for us. For us, open source, being open source was kind of necessary on account of it being a part of your infrastructure, kind of critical path stack. It was the easiest way to kind of enter, but kind of soon after that, because of the quality of the product itself and people really liking it and talking about with it to kind of each other, we kind of helped nurture a community to start forming around Hasura. And similar to kind of what was said before, we were very actively engaged and still are very actively engaged with our users to kind of keep talking to them, learning from them, informing our roadmap based on that, talking and sharing our roadmap. We do a monthly community call, for example, where we talk about, this is kind of what's been up over the last month. This is what's coming up, right? So we keep that very kind of tight engagement with the community and with people in the community who are kind of champions inside the community. As we kind of work towards the commercial offerings of our product, right? Like the first part of it was that open source distribution was really important. And then we had kind of a hypothesis around how we would have a commercial offering on top of this, right? And then when we kind of were moving towards that, again, those kind of user relationships that we built out were very helpful to validate kind of our hypotheses and then use them as early leads and making sure that kind of our price point is making sense to people. They're getting value out of this, right? So that was kind of what the early days of building a user base was, and then funneling some of them into kind of into a set of leads or commercial leads that would then go into the self-serve cloud platform or become leads for our enterprises.
Yeah, I think for Apollo, we had a slightly different journey. So we're mostly selling our customers, our B2B sales and marketing teams. So initially we used our own product to basically do B2B lead gen, finding, sales managers and reps and marketers and emailing them directly. And that generated probably our first 5 million, like the majority of our first 5 million or so in ARR, just like direct outbound outreach. And then I think as we went product-led, we started shifting our mix because a lot more of our leads and signups came more from inbound. I think right now the majority of our leads is just pure organic, and we also actually, just echoing on other people's points of building a great product first. I think as our NPS score went higher, like we saw a pretty direct correlation between the percentages of users that organically sign up, and so I think right now, we, it's just like as we build a brand and as we build the word of mouth, it's transitioned from mostly outbound to now like overwhelming majority organic inbound, backed by obviously a better and better product.
Tim, if I may ask a small follow-up question to that. So as you mentioned, you didn't start as a product-led growth company, it started as a sales-led go-to-market motion. what was it like, that overlap phase or that transition phase, where your sales-led growth business was still alive, and you were still building and launching the PLG in parallel? Because I mean, a lot of founders might have might be interested in in this phase, because many companies start as sales-led motion. But how do you sort of almost repair the airplane in the air? Because it's not that you're killing your old business, but at the same time you're also giving birth to your new motion. Maybe if you can briefly share what that transitory phase was like.
Yeah, definitely. It was a pretty long and challenging transition. So I think first is we need to build a super simple, self-serviceable product. And I think we've always had a very powerful product, but it was fairly complex. So I think first was like spending a lot of time just making the product simpler and more self-serviceable. And then next is, I think to make things product-led, the pricing needs to match. And so we need to, almost like make our pricing 20x less expensive than a sales-led motion, because the economics just, has to be, wouldn't work out otherwise. And so then we have to run some, just to de-risk the initiative, we ran a bunch of split tests on what happens if you send a very small subset of traffic to this new plan and see what the conversion rates are. And so I think that was helpful. And at some point though, like we started getting more and more traffic to the more product-led motion. And, I think that there is a leap of faith that one kind of has to do of like making that big jump. And I think there's just a lot of working with the sales team to just, soothe their concerns and in the end, everything worked out. But I think that transition process is, making sure, I think first and foremost is getting the product simpler and more streamlined. That's probably the hardest, changing the pricing, getting the sales team on board. And I think we also phase the transition so that we didn't do everything completely at once. It was like, maybe 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%, like 50% at the very end. I would say that's sort of our approach.
Fascinating. Thank you. Moving on, I went to all your products, and a common trait I could see, across all your products, and also, most other successful PLG companies, is how easy it is for a user to get started with the product, self-serve, and quickly see value. Can you share with the audience how you approach the overall product experience and identify or eliminate friction in the overall user flow?
I can start with that. I think so for us, one of the things that we had to address upfront was that Hasura is a very different type of product. It doesn't cleanly replace something that you have. It's a significant behavioral change for the user and for the developer. And behavior change is really, really hard. So for us, it was not even an option, but to not be kind of product led and have the product love kick in, because without that, it's impossible to drive behavior change. I mean, or you can be $1 trillion company and then drive behavior change by removing ports on a laptop. But as a startup, it's very, very hard to do that, right? So the way that we kind of thought about it was, what was really important for us was, and these are not useful numbers, but just as a heuristic for you to think about, is if you give your product to, if 100 people hear about your product somehow, right? You do a launch, you go to a hackathon, you go up on Hacker News, right? Wherever it is. If 100 people hear about the product, only like one of them is actually going to try it out over the weekend, right? Whenever they have time. And out of 100 people who try it out, only one of them is the kind of vocal developer that tells other people about it, right? So that means that kind of by the time you get to a threshold number of people who will talk about the product in an organic way, like that top of the funnel needs to be really high just to get to the people who will talk about the product, right? So that means that for us, it was removing every single barrier possible in making sure that from hearing about it to trying it to feeling happy with it, right? To getting your aha moment in the trying it out, that had to be incredibly smooth. some counterintuitive things, well, not really counterintuitive, but some interesting things that we did to kind of make that possible was that we kept our messaging very precise, not vague. So that like if we Hasura is data access as a service, right? That makes no sense. Like it makes sense to a lot of people at a very high level, right? But it's not going to select the right set of people. So we were very precise with the messaging, very technical with the messaging, and that automatically kind of selected a more precise set of people where the conversion probabilities are also higher, right? And every part of the product was geared towards that set of people, toward that kind of more precise community set rather than a much larger community set. And then, doing what was right for our technology and making sure that the ability to kind of try it out, the documentation around it. One of the things that we always talk about on the product side is the number of nouns that we use, right? We introduce the least number of nouns and concepts in the product, right? So we want to minimize the number of nouns, right? Like the number of new concepts that we introduce has to be like just bare minimum. So the learning curve is also is as low as possible, right? So that you go through that journey as quickly as possible. So so basically kind of thinking through that, right? Because if that motion was not successful, then the entire strategy would have to change. But those were kind of some of our experiences in those early days.
Actually, that's really interesting, Tanmai. I think I use the same vocabulary within Postman, right? Around the nouns, we just like, the additional thing that we do look at augmenting this is with like the verbs that people have to do and sort of like creating this like a graph of, right? Because I think one of the things that we have had to consciously, be very careful of is when Postman started out as a very simple product, right? You come in, you make a request, okay, done, right? But over time, the product itself has evolved, is solving like many different aspects of the API workflow. And I think keeping the product, the core experience itself simple enough has been an ongoing sort of like an exercise and a challenge that we have to do. And I think, the noun thing was really interesting because that's a realization that I also had at some point that, we look at this as a whole graph of interactions, even between those nouns as things start becoming more and more, complex and conceptual complexity starts creeping in through the product. And I think one of the key sort of like, it's a little hard to do, especially as organizations scale, but making sure that, if your internal communication itself retains that simplicity, the external communication, and the external product itself reflects that. So that's been another part of it. One of the things that, as we have grown as well, like I've tried to consciously, measure as well as, time to first action or time to like, for us, like it's an act of sending a request. So clicks to first action, time to first action, and constantly just assessing that and at least tracking that and constantly reassessing where that fits in. The second aspect for us as well has been the evolution of the product. Like, as the product has grown, we started with like a very clear persona of who that person using the product was, but I think that's itself has grown over time. And how do you cater and curate the product to the different experiences that people might have? And the I would say like the person who's consuming it like 2 hours a day, like Postman is sometimes used versus, somebody who's coming in for reports and stuff and accessing in 15 minutes a day. That itself leads to a different experience. And we've done more and more some experimentation around how we re-anchor the user experience around that.
Maybe another direction to take the conversation in, because it's relevant for really early stage startups, is that for us in the beginning, we knew that we wanted to be self-service, very low friction, but we chose not to in the beginning because we wanted to get enough feedback from customers. So in the very beginning, even though we had a panel that somebody could theoretically come into and create an account and do everything, we still put a wall in the middle of contacting us so that I could, as one of the two founders focusing on the business side, talk to everyone that was interested, learn what they were trying to do, and then better inform the next steps in the process. So that once we actually got to the point of, okay, this is what the self-service is going to look like, I had more information rather than just a pure hypotheses from the previous state or theoretically going into it. So that actually was really important for us and informed basically which type of markets to go after and how to present ourselves based on the kinds of words that customers used and the kinds of problems that they were trying to solve. So then once we actually got to the next stage of self-service, we also knew a lot more than we otherwise would know going into it. Then there was another inflection point there where we chose not to do a free tier yet. We did a credit card self-service, again, to not blow open the doors with too much growth coming in through, but to, again, see what happens, how do people use it. And once we saw, again, some patterns, we turned on the free tier, which then greatly increased our growth factor of a lot of people that started testing it, not necessarily signing up eventually or initially, but then they did sign up eventually. And in each of those stages really helped us in informing each of the next stages again.
That I think it's very interesting, the adding the friction at the start part, which you mentioned. In our case, the outcome was the same, but we kind of tried to approach it slightly differently. So both me and my co-founder, in the very early days, we had put in a live chat option where, the number of requests were limited, and we used to just pop up and say like, hey, what are you liking? What are you not liking? And just conduct a live session with our users who are using, right? And we were also, I think those early conversation was super important for us to shape what was the next thing which we had to build. So we, again, try to kind of achieve that same result with that chat hack. And definitely in the early days, I would recommend everyone, just put that and, spend some time. It's like probably the fastest way to hack your user, interviews. But coming back to Abhishek, your original question, at Quizziz, when we think about our product, it's used by a very diverse set of experience. Even if we talk just from one geography, you have very early age students who are using, to like a teacher who is in their final years of retirement. So for us, it was very kind of like, I mean, that's an ongoing thing where we also were trying to figure out, right, like how do you get to that initial early aha moment. Unlike especially in some of more developer focused products where there's a high activation energy, in our case, we try to build it like a consumer company, where our initial thought was, what can be that one small use case which we can solve for a user, where there's limited commitment which is required from them. And during that time period, can we build a memorable experience so that they then come back next, right? They get hooked to that product. So we also started with, I think Ankit mentioned, they started with an API first. For us also, it was the first experience, which is just finding that quiz, which is just customized for you, doing one click, and then, you are there. Once that happens, then the user gets into the other parts of, they get our attention to explore the other parts of the product. But for us, we are looking to kind of, really, we try to figure out how many clicks it take for a teacher to reach that aha moment. And from there, I think it becomes, you also build a relationship with the customer, and they are willing to spend more time and put more commitment with you.
Fascinating. Sorry, go ahead, Tim, please.
Oh, I just want to add, I think for us, two of the most helpful things that we did, is just setting up the proper systems and instrumentation. So getting the analytics set up to understand what percent of your users go from setup to aha moment, let's say, and then building an A/B testing framework where we could send half the traffic, let's say, to one experience and half the traffic to the other experience. And then once we do that, just do a bunch of experiments on tweaking different pages and getting using the data to understand which path is the winner. And I think just if we do that 100 times, then essentially we were able to pretty consistently improve our activation and just with that sort of system. So that's something that I think it took us some time to invest in, but once we have that investment has paid off many fold.
Fantastic. We have one question, from the audience that since we are on this topic, maybe I can just add here is, how do you engage with early users without the functional product? Since people hate surveys and all, at a point when your functional product is not really ready, how did you go about engaging with those early users? Any of you want to take this?
Yeah, Abhishek, I can maybe perhaps start. So I'd say, at least in our case, we had, we were trying a product in the similar space, and we had a early set of users where, again, the product in the early days, the way you launch it is just the bare bones, right? Like, how do you figure out whether this works or not works? And during that time period, I would say, like, just at least for us, being very nimble helped, where even if it is the set of 10 users, you if they come to your website, you can kind of create those opportunities where they can talk with us. I talked about that chat experience, but then post that also, right? Like, when the number of emails are limited, right? You can personally write actually each one of them an email. And that, at least for us, helped in the very early phase, right? As the product starts evolving, even your feedback mechanism also has to evolve. So even we started with the live chat, then both me and my co-founder were the first even technical support individuals, right? Because there you used to get so many ideas. So we used to spend a lot of time just solving the tickets. Now, as we have scaled, we have scaled these platforms also. So now there is a very engage, I'll say, a functional community, where community itself, if they're passionate, they come in, they talk about ideas, they kind of upvote and do this. But in the early days, at least for us, just doing it, right, like spending time and just reaching out, people, especially who come in, they are passionate about, and they are experimental, and they're willing to spend time. At least that was what worked for us.
Thank you. Thanks, Ankit. We get this, joke a lot that in product-led growth, product leads, but then at some point sales follows, or all roads lead to sales. Whether it is to go up market or to talk to enterprises. So in your companies, how did you set up the sales motion, and how did you know when to hire the first salespeople, and more broadly, how do you nurture and qualify the leads for the sales team?
So for us, I think we went through probably 3-4 step transition. So initially it was just pure sales led, and then we made it half product led, half sales led, where like inbound leads came in, and those sales would just do a full cycle, and then some product people will self-serve. And then I think it switched to sales mostly being a reactive support role, where people writing in, having just pricing questions, and wanting to most of them are already use the product, so it becomes almost like more of a support role. And I think now we're transitioning into sales being much more proactive, so having them proactively figure out clusters of high user engagement, whether on free plans or lower tiered month-to-month paid plans, and then having sales proactively hunt and try to expand those clusters of adoption into larger deals. So yeah, so I guess that for us, that was our transition from sales.
Yeah, for FingerprintJS, even though we are developer focused, product-led growth, et cetera, we knew from the very beginning that the biggest contracts and most of our revenue was going to come from larger enterprises. So it was segmentation in the beginning that helped us determine when did we need to do sales, how much effort we needed to put in, and we basically use a pretty straightforward metric, which is the amount of traffic that a website has on the domain based on SimilarWeb or Alexa or any other sources to segment, where signups or leads go. So if there are smaller domain, or we don't know what the traffic levels are, we allow them to continue self-service, and we have customer success reach out to them. If they're a larger domain with more than a certain amount of traffic, we have sales reach out to them. And in the beginning, it was me as the business co-founder focusing on that. And then once we got to a certain amount of scale, that's when we realized it was time to start hiring other salespeople, basically when I ran out of time to be able to do it. But again, it was really important for one of the co-founders to be having those conversations in the beginning, because it informed a lot of other things in our business. So both when to hire the next set of people to assist with sales or customer success, and also when to make changes in the business itself.
Yeah. Abhishek, in our case, it was very experimental. I still remember we started with a self-serve model, and there, just as an experiment in the final checkout page, we put out a link as a very experimental thing, which goes to Typeform where, a lead can get generated. And I still recall we launched it on Thursday, and by Saturday morning, I was sure, right? Like we probably need to set some CRM. So I compiled together a CRM on my Gmail during the weekend, and I became like the first salesperson. So for us, it was very much driven by our community itself. So our self-serve was able to serve set of individual requirement, but once we got into this motion, we very quickly realized that there are these different personas, and for some the self-serve work, but then once you start going in at an organization level, there are a sales can really add value. And for me, I was the first salesperson for first 2 to 3 months, and I really realized, okay, now we need like a professional sales team. So for us, I would say it was very organic, where we experimented and we saw the personas, and then we were really sure that, hey, the sales can really complement our self-served motion.
Right. Okay, I'll just share Postman's story around this part, right? So I think most of our journey, has had this element of organic in it, right? So I think when we started out the product, before we started as a company itself, we had like about 500,000 users of the product, but as a single user. And, this is 2014. So, collaboration as a business model was still not the most established at that point in time. But we took that bet, that, APIs are fundamentally collaborative, and, obviously the tooling that is used to build APIs has to be collaborative. So why don't we, start building in that direction? So we started that out, and, the product went from being useful for one person to being useful for like a small team. So I would be like one team of, let's say, led by an engineering manager, and I would be able to collaborate better on the APIs between the front-end developer or back-end developer. Right. And this, interestingly, we ran as like a beta like product. We built it out really quickly because we wanted to validate this. And this we ran in beta with our users for a long period of time. So we built it out in 2 months, and we ran the beta for almost 9 months after that. So about 4 or 5 months of private beta, and another 4 or 5 months of like public beta. And what was interesting was that a lot of people who were active on the beta at the end of the 9-month period actually converted. So for us, that was validation, and in the beginning about the fact that, okay, yes, this collaboration thing actually had the product market fit, right? And which is when we evolved onto the next stage of our growth as such. But as we grew, I think, the product itself started evolving, right? Like it went from like something that was useful for one person to small team to, a few teams to now organizations, right? That evolution itself around the sales side also happened. So we started then eventually, as we were growing a lot, and the teams grew, the user base grew. We started first focusing on sales ops, more or less, like just acting as the unblocker. Okay, who's blocking, your adoption, right? Basically targeting the end user, not the buyer, right? That was the first part. So the end user is, okay, what's unblocking you from using the product? What's blocking you? Let's go unblock that. So that was about, the security team, let's go do aspects of that. Let's, looking at, let's say, legal, okay, let's figure out a way to unblock that. And that was the evolution of that. And eventually, as a target sort of like buyer also, especially as you're targeting organizations, you're probably now looking at CXOs and VPs, right? So then the conversation itself changes. And this is where you obviously need a more formalized sales process. So that was our, I think, organic evolution towards how sales evolved at Postman.
I think on the Hasura side, and this is a perspective of firm that is probably maybe more applicable to the domain that we are in, which is this kind of infrastructure type situation where there is a little bit of complexity in integrating Hasura into your stack, right? I think like a self-serve motion works really well. The places where the self-serve motion needs a sales element to it, and where sales becomes necessary, is wherever there is any form of complexity in usage, in I won't say adoption, because adoption should get figured out a little bit before ideally, but in the usage evaluation and in the purchase part, right? Wherever there is complexity, that's kind of where sales needs to be involved, right? So for example, on the usage side, it might be it's more sales engineering perhaps that you need, because you need to help teams connect it to their system so that they can see what is valuable, so that they can kind of get value from the product and understand if it's going to be valuable for them. And then on the purchase side, there's complexity because that might get introduced because of the price point itself. But it also might be complexity just because of the nature of the product, that the person who has to sign off has to be an architect or a centralized architecture team, right? And it has to come from a different budget, right? So those kinds of, so wherever there is kind of that complexity, then you need a human being to navigate that complexity, right? At least like that's the way I would think about it in the early stages. And wherever that complexity is not required for usage and purchase, I mean, self-serve works really well, right? And self-serve scales also to a decent amount, right? Of course, there'll be a certain point where it will not scale in terms of price point. But at that time, your product is also probably becoming complicated enough to demand a larger price point, which means that there's a high correlation with the price point and the usage complexity, right? At least for our kinds of products. So that's kind of the way we think about sales, right? It's like wherever we feel that there's going to be a lot of complexity for our users to evaluate / purchase any of those two parts of the journey, then we like our sales team to be involved as early as possible.
And Tanmai, small, very interesting, small follow-up to on that to you and others is, as we look at self-serve versus human touch. Not just sales, but overall customer or user engagement. How do you balance between what should be touchless and what should be human touch in the overall user or customer journey, whether it is introducing sales or success or customer support or anything else? In the product roadmap, like how do you guys all think about where to have human touch? And where to completely delaborize over time?
So obviously the idea is to keep removing the human touch as much as necessary over time, right? To not require sales engineering, to not require a sales army and stuff like that. Like you want them only for the right things, right? Ideally, you want it to only become organizational complexity that needs to be navigated and nothing else that needs to be navigated, right? That would then be the most kind of suitable. You would change from an MQL SQL way of thinking to a PQL way of thinking, like a product qualified way of thinking. But I think in the early days, to kind of balance between whether one should do sales or whether it should be self-serve and stuff like that, that's a very hard question. And I think it's a very strategic question that I think like the founders and the team have to kind of answer for themselves, right? It's like, what kind of company do you want to build? Both, which is a function of the market that you're in, the product that you are, and the DNA of the team itself, right? They have to align very well. And whatever that aligns to is probably going to be the answer more than anything else, right? It's like you strategically, you want to do the least number of things at the same time. You want to focus because just the reality of like resource crunch is that you want to make sure that you're as focused as possible. And then from there, when you try to figure out whether you want to do self-serve or not, it kind of depends on that. If your product is inherently fairly complex to consume, then sales might be necessary, right? If your product is amenable to a self-serve motion, the buyers and the users can be self-serve in the initial days, right? Then great, that's what you want to pursue. But again, for both of them, the early team needs to have that DNA, right? Or needs to hire and bring in that DNA as a part of that team. Otherwise, it's very hard. As a person that wants to think in a product-led self-serve kind of way, you can't just turn on and understand what the right kind of sales-led motion to build is, right? You can't do that. And if you come from a sales-heavy background, it's very hard to move towards the self-serve thing. It requires it's commendable. Like while Tim was talking, I was just like, it's amazing, right? That transition is phenomenal, right, to pull off because it's hard. It's a lot of mental churn for people, right? So that's kind of my take on it, right? It's like a confluence of factors that at that moment in time will determine kind of how you want your strategy to play out and then decide according to that. So not an answer, but a perspective.
Great. And moving on, all of you have I noticed a freemium pricing model. How do you come up with pricing and continue to optimize it? And how do you decide what value to offer in the free tier, especially?
We did a bunch of like surveys, or not survey, interviews. I think we talked to maybe 40, 50 users and had a bunch of features that we broke out, and we asked each of them like how much what's the most they might pay, what the least they would pay. And I think based on that kind of data, and like segmented by who those users were, try to bucket groups of features based on their persona and their needs into what we thought make the most sense. So I think that was definitely super informative. Had a lot of really surprising aspects where things we thought they would pay a lot, they wouldn't, but things that we thought they wouldn't pay a lot, they would. I think that probably was for us the most helpful, is just talking to a lot of users and just asking them like pretty bluntly and directly.
I can maybe provide like our position here, right? So I mentioned like about the trial that we ran, like the beta that we ran, and then saw a bunch of people convert. So in the beginning, right, we saw value in that trial. So we actually went ahead with like the classical model. Okay, you have a 30-day trial, use as many people as you want, and collaborate on your APIs, right? And that was interesting. But one of the realization that we kind of had an inkling that as we were looking at behavior, right, that most of the behavior was being driven in the final like week or so, which was the collaborative behavior because of which people were paying for it, right? So we ran this experiment, kind of like an A/B test in the beginning, and eventually just made that a full thing. That instead of having a 30-day trial, we had a 7-day trial. And when we ran a 7-day trial, we realized that there was actually no change in behavior. The purchase percentage actually remained the same, whether it was 30-day or 7-day. And the only thing that was triggering the last week behavior was basically the fact that we were sending out an email like a week before the trial was about to expire. So I think the whole time-based notion of it was a realization that was just a mirage, because people are either looking at value, and even if it's like 6 months or 7 days or 30 days, it actually doesn't really matter. So as a part of that, our freemium sort of evolved not to be like a trial, but actually, and we started sort of like aligning with the fact that our user base itself was evolving, because initially the product was useful for like a 5% team, but then the product was useful for like a 20% team. So instead of doing that, I think the way that we evolved it is that why don't you, have a limit in usage? So you can collaboratively, collaborate on these many things, which was an interesting evolution, right? So we saw a lot more people trying out certain things. Kind of, you can think of it like the Slack model, where you have 10,000 messages that are collaboratively available, right? So that was also interesting, and we learned a lot from that experiment, kind of aligned with where our user base and our product was at that point in time. But over time, that itself evolved into that, the limits itself make a lot of sense on a messaging product, but probably don't make sense on a product where you are creating that content, that IP, that is what you're building around, which is like your API definitions. Right? So then we evolved to the fact that our business model had evolved now towards targeting larger teams. And then we decided that, okay, up to 3, which is the behavior that we were observing where people had the maximum amount of, just variability, we just make that segment free. So it helped a lot because, for that segment, giving them a free product basically meant that, people didn't actually have to take decisions very early on. They continued using the product. And when their team grew, the product organically grew with that. But it was a 3-stage experimental, highly data-driven point to get to this thing, right? Maybe like a year from now, when I'm talking about this, there might be a different premium model itself that might exist then.
Just to add to what Ankit was saying, I think we took a I'm not sure how to compare the approach, but I think what was helpful was we did a little bit of back of the envelope kind of calculations, right? And we said, all right, given this kind of a product, given the kind of underlying traction and growth, right, and how that will move forward, what kind of pricing can we do, right? On the enterprise side, because it always depends, right? 10K, 100 customers is very different from 50K, 100 customers, which is very different from 100K, 100 customers, right? Those price points mean that for certain revenue goals, for growth goals, your number of customers you need is very different, right? So we did a little bit of back of the envelope math to say that on the enterprise side, to kind of grow this, right? Just projecting outwards optimistically, pessimistically, whatever, just back of the envelope, this is a price point that we need to establish in this range. And on the cloud side, this is a price point that we need to establish in this range for this to move forward, right? In the way that we want. And of course, all of this is back of the envelope. Nothing is probably going to remain true a few years down the line and stuff like that, right? So it'll change every time. But at that point of time, from whatever you can project, there'll be some range that will come in there, right? And then what we wanted to do with the commercial offering was prove to ourselves and our users in the community that that price point makes sense, right? So that we land at the right price point. So we land at the right number. And for us, that number was, like in the 75K, 100K range for enterprise, and that number was 100-ish for cloud, right? Given a free tier. And so that's kind of what we set out to establish, right? So that kind of then was a little bit of a forcing function in the way that we organized GTM, in the way that we even thought about the product roadmap to make sure that we are able to get to that price point. And, hopefully what always happens is that you always think that the price is a little bit lower. So the price will always keep increasing once there's a tighter fit that keeps happening. So then you can keep increasing the price. But that was kind of one way that we thought about it. That's been interesting. Like it's been very interesting, and it's informed our strategy quite a bit. It's not, we didn't have to play kind of blind. Should we do $5 a month, $10 a month, $15 a month? Should we do 20K, 50K, 75K, 100K, right? It's really confusing. But pegging it a little bit from where you want to get to could be helpful. So that strategy might work.
I would add, Abhishek, I think for us, it was very critical. So we didn't start with a freemium. We started with a complete free product. And for us, it was very critical to make sure we get the right critical mass in the platform, because in our case, content ends up playing like a big goal on growth. So we wanted to make sure we don't add any friction for our early set of users to adopt the product. So we started from free, and then the transition was more from free to freemium. How do you go about it? Of course, during that time, there's always a fear, right? Like you have already built something which your people like, high NPS, right? Like how do you go about this? I think like what Tim mentioned, even in our case, product is never done, right? Like there are always more things which people want. And in our case, we were constantly hearing a bunch of features which either there were restrictions in the existing offering or the new set of features which people wanted. And at that point, we just said that, hey, today this is not available, but we'll build it. How much would you pay, right? Like, would you pay X? Would you pay Y? And that definitely defined us an understanding on where the market is, what they are willing to pay for it. We also are seeing something like what Ankit is saying, right? Like initially when you started, it started with more of like on a certain, your pricing plan was structured in a certain way. But then as the time progresses, you continue to evolve it, right? So even for us, it started with a first X set of, I would say, more feature-led or feature-gated pricing, but then it ended up moving more towards limit-based, right? And what I've heard from Ankit is for them, it has evolved even further, right? So one thing, even for us, like that's like a constant thing, right? Like pricing is never done. I also feel many times in a freemium product, you also, one thing has to be very clear that perhaps many times your free product itself can be your biggest competitor, right? Like, so you just need to kind of iterate and balance that out.
Yeah, just to add the FingerprintJS perspective, the way that we did pricing is segmentation by the types of customers, right? So the free tier is intended for small developers or small projects that just want to test something out, don't have like a large amount of usage. The middle self-service tier is priced in a way that you can do a small project, run it for a while, and then eventually potentially expand into the actual enterprise pricing. And then the enterprise pricing is just based on typical enterprise pricing of what does the company look like on the other side, what's the size of the business, and more around like the distribution model. So those are kind of the three segments within it, and we're still experimenting with the right ways to attach each of those. And we use a dollar per 1,000 API calls as a proxy for that, and then use discounts as a way to fit it better based on the value that the customers actually are getting from our solution.
Great. maybe we can take one. We can maybe have one more question, then we can get into audience Q&A. Maybe I can begin with Ankit Sobti here. So Ankit, I've seen you and Abhinav extensively speak, practice about what you call API first organization. Can you decode for rest of us what it means and how can that lead to achieving product-led growth? And maybe if I may add, how would you define the right culture, for a PLG company? Maybe we can start with you and then others can chime in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really interesting question. And I think it's one of the things, right? Like API first itself is, there are so many meanings to that word right now because it's like one of those words that just has a lot of phrasing, I think, in the ecosystem right now. So part of our exercise has also been about, defining that, like what our positioning is. Anyway, but let me answer this question, right? So if I come to the core, right, like APIs, in my opinion, are fundamentally about collaboration that exists between systems, collaboration that exists between teams, collaboration that exists between organizations, right? And API first is a way of systematically enabling and fostering this collaboration. So we have seen like API first companies, the way that we look at API first, as companies that use APIs as the building blocks for their software strategy and the way that they enable this collaboration within that ecosystem and actually also enable the business goals that they want to achieve with respect to their APIs. I think I'm guessing like a lot of us on this group itself are using APIs to actually add an additional channel to our business to support that. So we always look at API first companies having these kind of like these superpowers, right? Like the ability to, connect your internal APIs with your external APIs and how you have this end-to-end strategy, which allows you to build innovative products faster, build higher quality products, go to market, having different channels to go to market itself to support all of that. Now, this is again, not the easiest thing to do. And, there are a few like philosophical and cultural shifts that need to happen to support that because this entire notion relies on the ability to foster collaboration even within your organization. And I think culturally, like we have had to do a lot of that to foster this collaboration, the way that we, win together as in the way that we build our products itself. One additional point that I'll add to that is, that one important facet of API first is also about thinking about your APIs not as wrappers on top of code, but actually thinking about your product APIs as products itself. And you see companies like, Stripe, Twilio doing that really, really well. Like the entire business model is built on top of the API, and you have like $100 billion companies, on that entire notion, right? So I think for us, it's a lot about making sure that there is an end-to-end shift that supports this notion. So, and having this strong culture of collaboration that exists within an organization that is, systematically fostered allows you to unlock all of these capabilities that you externalize from your organization itself, including opening up additional channels for your business to succeed.
Great. I guess we can get into audience questions. We have quite a few of them to go through. So yeah, maybe if we can keep the answers quick so that we can get through as many of them as we can. First question, was there a distinct moment that made you realize you have hit product market fit? What was hitting PMF anchored around a specific metric or any quality of feedback? Would be curious to hear thoughts from the panel.
I think I can start. I think for us that the beta thing that I mentioned, right, was a very critical one because, the product market fit for us at that point in time was fundamentally about the business model, right? We had a validated product that made sense for a single user, but it was about, finding, the fit for the collaboration side of our product, which is are people actually willing to build out their APIs collaboratively. And the validation was literally that we had a significant percentage of people who were using the application collaboratively just actually decided to put dollars on it. And that's when we knew that the collaborative side of our product actually worked because we had the validation kick in at that point in time.
Excellent. One question, various versions of that, Ankit folks are asking, but essentially, how did you know what product to build, being far away from your users, both geographically and culturally, because you started the company in Bangalore, your users are everywhere. Maybe you can unpack for the audience.
Sure.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, sorry. Which Ankit was that for?
Actually, both of you can answer this. Now that
Okay.
you tell.
Why don't you take it,
sure,
Ankit ji?
so Abhishek, for us, I think, and if I'll take a moment and just walk everyone through our journey, right? So for us, Quizziz was not our first product. We initially started with more of a math program. And the reason why we had picked math was we felt math is universal across, there are no geographical boundaries which are present. But we started our journey with a math program, and the mission even during that time point was like, how do you solve for motivation? Today information is available, but as a teacher, I'm struggling to like really motivate the students. And that is where our journey started. In fact, even when we started, we started collaborating with a non-profit school within Bangalore, and the idea was like for middle school kids, like how do you get them excited about math? I'd say like during that time, we were not being super strategic on saying that, hey, this is only for US or only for India. We just felt that there was a universal need, and it should then provide the value to users around the world. So our journey is like, hey, we started with that math program, put it out. We started seeing that most of our usage actually started from US. And this is back in around 2015 ish, where most of our usage was coming from the teachers in US. And I talked about some of the hacks, right? Like just putting the chat, being very close to them, having a conversation with them, helped us realize that there were a couple of main gaps which were present. So one was just as a teacher, I wanted some flexibility on like really deciding what content gets served to my students. The other part was coming from the kids. They were like, hey, I like your virtual world, but I want to be in this world with my friends. So those were like the signals which we got. Given that communication channel which was available with our users, we kind of again built it with more of a platform approach, definitely keeping English as our primary kind of audience. But once we put this out, we saw that the challenge around this motivation is universal, right? Like if either for a kid sitting in California or in Jakarta, like everyone, teachers around the world were struggling on this. And we kind of, I'll again repeat myself there, but like just being close to our audience, this gave us an understanding on what problem we are solving, right? And once that is solved, I think many times, it's universal, especially when you are kind of going after a large problem. So at least that is what ended up working for us. From a more, as we started expanding in different geographies, we have definitely customized things, right? Like let's say Southeast Asia versus what we serve in US, but fundamentally the problem statement still stayed the same. Other thing, if I have to add, was that we went with a platform first approach. So we were not doing any content. In our case, our community was building that content, and from day zero, we had built with UTF in mind, where we supported languages across the world. And that was, I would say, that other thing which helped us both attract users from around the world, but then also serve them in a good way.
The next question is, oh, sorry, Ankit, you wanted to add?
Oh, okay. I mean, I think the main thing for us primarily was definitely that, we realized that, when we were building out this application very early on, we had a lot to learn, right? And I think the community for us was the place where we learned, because it was like this burgeoning community where we had a bunch of people talking about, okay, can you add this feature? Can you give me this? This is how I'm building my system. And I think we spent a lot of time in that community. Like if you look at our early GitHub issues, right, you'll just find us there like all the time, just seeking feedback, asking for okay, try this, building things out. And I think that is a very, very important part of just the initial stage of our journey, is just getting that feedback from our users. And that, because the problem statements were not geographically constrained, people had similar problems. That's why we just had this community that I think nurtured a lot by participating actively, very, very actively around that. And that made, I think, a big difference in how much we learned about APIs in the process, how that reflected in the product, but also, how we evolved the product to take in that direction.
That's great. Dan, one question for you. There are several examples of customers starting self-serve at, let's say, $1,000 a month and expanding organically to multi-year, six-figure ACV contracts, all inbound. Can you very quickly share with the audience how the expansion works for business like FingerprintJS?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's been one of the most exciting things about working on an API-driven business is that a customer can come in, sign up self-service, start using it to solve some narrow problem, see that there's good value for it, and then expand it to the rest of their website, more of their geographies, or even solve different problems. So there's been several examples in our history of things like that happening. So I can share a couple examples. So for example, one of our larger customers is a grocery delivery startup. They started solving one narrow problem in one geography, got up to like $1,000 a month in the usage just purely on self-service before they even talked to us. We noticed that they were at $1,000 a month. So we reached out to them, started providing them, more help and answered more questions about what other things they could solve using our technology. Then from there, they continued expanding it. We had another conversation and another conversation. And then eventually after 9 months, we signed an annual contract with them for over $65,000 a year and basically covered their entire website in one geography. And it's continuing to expand over time to even larger contracts. So it shows that even starting at a very small price point, $100 a month, self-service, can eventually become an enterprise contract as long as you show the value. And there's been a number of other companies where very similar patterns have happened. So again, a very exciting thing about product-led growth, API-driven businesses, is that we provide the tools to the business and they build and they get more value, they pay us, and everybody wins.
Great. Tim, next question is for you. The two similar questions, I can ask them together. So what was the reason or trigger you decided to move from sales-led growth to PLG, and how did you simplify your product along the way?
Yeah, so I think we are going after the mass market. So a lot of SMB, smaller startups in particular. And for them, it's very hard to sell your way to 1 million, 10 million small startups, and economics also just doesn't work sense. I think sales works if you're targeting enterprise or upper mid market, but it doesn't really work for SMB. So I think our mission is to help every business be able to go to market. So I think it's like logically, if we built it from the beginning, we probably would have done product-led to begin with. So that was just like the market and channel fit, if you will. And in terms of how we simplify the product, it was a combination of instrumenting the metrics and building the quantitative foundations to be able to run A/B tests and measure the results. We also use tools like FullStory to look at users and where they got stuck in the onboarding process. And we also did this exercise where we took a printout of our app and then literally just took a bit of marker and tried to cross out every single possible thing that we could and built like the most simple possible idiot-proof dummy product. And then so basically subtracted everything and then started with a clean slate. So I think those are some things that we did to help us make the product simpler.
Next question is it's an interesting question. I guess all of you can chime in. Do certain technologies or segments augur better for product-led growth? For example, are consumer or prosumer technologies versus enterprise? Does B2C lend itself better than B2B for PLG? And even within B2B, do certain personas lend themselves better for PLG, like developer or SRE or security administrator? I mean, it's a lot of questions in one question, but any thoughts from you guys? Like, does it matter where PLG can be successful based on user persona, or whether it's a B2C or B2B, or maybe I'll add to the question, a B2D developer facing product?
Yeah, so in my experiences, I can compare my previous startup to the startup. So in the previous startup that I did, it was a search engine for used machinery. So the types of customers that we worked with were used machinery dealers and people in that industry. So they were a lot less technically savvy than the current industry for FingerprintJS, which is like developer focused, like B2D, like Abhishek mentioned. And it was like night and day, where we couldn't get the machinery industry to adopt new products unless we spent a lot of time training them, explaining to them how the technology worked. Even getting them to use like typical SaaS products was very challenging. Whereas now in the opposite extreme, having a focus on developers, we don't have to put that much effort into it. We put documentation on the website and allow them to do everything self-service. And I've been amazed by the types of things that developers using our technology have been able to build with no direction from us. They come to us, they provide feedback about things that we can do better, bugs that we have in our system that never happened in the previous startup. So for me, it's basically you need to have a lot more savvy customers to be able to work with PLG in the beginning until you get to a much larger stage where you can have the resources that you can train people on that. So again, with the previous startup, we had a product called Machinery Host that was a self-service CRM for dealers to use. And it didn't work unless we did all the training for the customers. And we can only do all the training for the customers once we had the resources to be able to invest into that, right? So for any early stage startup, I think the focusing on customers that can come in, look at your website and do everything themselves is a lot more scalable, and you can learn from that and get to a higher resource level before you can invest in and do the hand-holding process.
Great. And the next, a lot of folks have questions around team building for a PLG company. So how did you go about building your team? Example, the first 5 to 10 employees outside of the co-founders, and how to look for talent, especially people who share the passion about product. And are there any nuances you look for in hiring for product-led growth businesses compared to a sales-led business?
I think for us, one team structure that was helpful is having separate product teams and growth teams. So product team is about building out core functionality and new features, and they have like more of a roadmap of things to build this quarter, next quarter. And then we have a separate growth team that's all optimized around improving the metrics. So improving our activation, improving our retention, improving our monetization across the entire product suite. And they're more of an experimentation mindset. They don't even know what they're going to work on at the start of any quarter, but they're just constantly running experiments to try to improve the metrics. So we found that like after introducing the growth team, our ability to just make our funnel much more frictionless was increased dramatically.
I would add, Abhishek, I think in our case, one thing which really helped was, especially in the early days when you are more in the experiment side of things, right? Like you're really trying to figure out what you want to do. Having a small team really helped us, right? So we in fact had a small team of around 20 folks till we scaled to like 70 million monthly actives also. But for one thing I've seen that having that in the early phases, especially before you have hit your product market fit, having that small team gives you that flexibility to really move fast and do these experimentation in a good way. From a team structure, for us, we had tried to kind of get folks who can wear multiple hats. So, they understood both the tech side of things, but then also had the empathy for the user. So kind of that was at least in my experience, some of those winning things, especially for your first 5 or 10 employees,
And this question is probably, for Dan and Ankit Sobti. Are there any unique challenges of building a developer-focused business, and what are the various segments, cohorts that you have for your developer tools? How did you decide at the early stage who to build the product for?
I think for us, it wasn't so much challenges. Sorry, Ankit, I'll just go real quick. There weren't so many challenges, more benefits for working with developers. I think for us, we could design the business, the documentation, the service, everything around what we would want as engineers because of our engineering backgrounds. That made it much easier than, again, compared to my previous startup, like trying to sell to machinery dealers when I don't know them. I've never worked in the industry. It was much more challenging. So for us, it was a huge boon to focus on developers first. The bigger challenge was actually going from developers to enterprise, where the way they think about problems, like how we actually get them to pay us and how to price it and all those things, were a lot less intuitive than doing the first version with developer focus.
Yeah, and I think very, very similar response itself, right? Like I think for us as well, even in the beginning, it was a lot about, problems that made sense to us as developers, right? And we ended up solving for things that were just in our adjacencies. But we learned a lot in the process, I think, and as we evolved towards, different segments within the companies, right? Especially, as we started interacting with a lot more people, and I think that's when our product itself evolved to support that. But over time, I think now we have added a lot more segments that typically didn't come from where we started out around, even security engineers and so on, which was just really interesting to see how that evolution happened and how API is impacting like different segments in the in the organization.
Are there any specific metrics you track to measure the success or not of your PLG strategy? And what are some of those metrics?
So for us, we have this framework so obviously user retention is the most important metric in any PLG company, but you can break down retention into like activation and engagement. And then within each, we break it down. So for activation, ultimately, we have 3 states like setup moment, aha moment, and habit moment. So setup is what % of the users are able to do the things needed to even get value in the product in the first place. Aha is getting that value. And then habit is doing that aha moment a few times so that they build a habit, and that correlates with long-term retention. And then once they become use the product a little bit, then there's different levels of engagement. So we have different ways to track whether or not they're a basic user or an advanced user or a power user, and driving them up that engagement funnel is the second order of goal after we get them to be activated. And so a lot of our product instrumentation is around those activation and engagement, which ultimately drives retention.
At what point did you know that you have hit product market fit? Are there any indicators that other founders can use where user feedback is truly an indicator of PMF?
I'd say, Abhishek, your graph itself starts telling you are hitting the PMF. So if things start moving more on the right side, but because I'll give an example, right? Like when we were working on our first product, things, it was also organically growing, picking up. But when we moved to Quizziz, we saw that the kind of engagement numbers which we had reached in the past 1 year time period was just done in like 6 weeks. So you just knew that things are moving in the right direction. At this point, even when we have scaled the new initiatives we take, we kind of end up just optimizing for the NPS there. And just seeing that if your NPS are constantly hitting the right set, then there's a true love for any new feature also. And there, for us, kind of, that gives us an indicator we are in the right path.
I think for me, I'm a little bit more old school in terms of product market fit, which is it's about money and repeatability. So if a customer is willing to put money down to solve their problems, and a lot of them are willing to do it, and the amount of money is increasing or above a certain threshold, then it means that you have product market fit, right? Because we spend a lot of time talking to customers that are very excited about the technology, but until they can actually fit budget in their enterprise or continue to renew, because again that's repeatability aspect, or it happens with multiple companies, because we can also get lucky again with a company or two that again just loves the technology but doesn't actually solve a real problem with it. Until we can see that, then you don't really have product market fit.
The next question is to Ankit Sobti. So Ankit, at what point did you get marketing involved to drive PLG, and what was the team composition in terms of roles and responsibilities?
Yeah, that's a very good question and a very interesting answer as well, because it's not an easy question to figure out in this specifics. It wasn't an easy question to figure out, right? So I think, and it's also been evolving, because in the beginning, I think one of the factors for us for the product, because it was growing very, very rapidly on its own, right? And we actually didn't need to amplify like the recognition of the core product, right? Okay, you know what, have you heard of Postman? Yes. Right. So a lot of it was actually not about getting people to the top of the funnel, but actually moving them through it. And I think that's why we strategically looked at marketing. But I think for us, marketing has been, more and more over time focused towards like the enterprise positioning. Like, what is an API platform? Now, that's a question that we need to define fundamentally, right? Like, what is an API first company? Like, that's another sort of like very heavy marketing question that is about repositioning. It's about interacting with analysts and, sort of like just positioning ourselves in the market. So I think for us, it was not something that we did very early on, because, we had the levers that we were playing to increase the core adoption of the product was primarily community driven and product led. But over time, especially as we get into the enterprise ecosystem, especially as, Tanmai earlier mentioned, right? Like, as the dollar amount increases in the organization, you are now suddenly talking about this thing to somebody who's probably not the end user of your product anymore. And that's where marketing played a role. So I think for us, it's been a lot about, the positioning in the ecosystem, framing of the API specific market, and then driving our message through that.
There's an interesting question from the audience. Do the co-founders need to come from a technology background for building a PLG company? What do you guys think?
I'm probably the wrong person to answer that question, because it's a developer-centric product, and I think we kind of had to, we were building it for ourselves, but I'll let somebody else take it.
Tim, Ankit, Gupta, we are, I guess, looking at you then.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also am still a developer, right? Like, so definitely, I'd say that the advantage which one can get from being tech first might be just the experimentation, the pace at which you can experiment. But if one can complement that, I believe, you can definitely go after that PLG motion, because the constant theme which we have heard from everyone in the panel is that we build something which people wanted, right? Like, and hitting that many times, your first attempt might not be right. So figuring out that good MVPs and iterating over it, I feel that is where maybe perhaps the tech background might help. I mean, I'm biased here, but that would be my take.
Yeah, I think it probably helps. I think we sell sales software, and usually most companies in the space are more sales-led CEOs. I'm definitely more of an engineer by trading, and just naturally am tuned to try to make the product as simple and delightful as possible. So I think in a PLG company, I think that product is first, and there's probably some natural inclination that helps there.
Great answer. In a B2B product offering with limited access to users, how do you drive retention, especially with no or limited feedback loop? Tim, you want to start?
So to drive retention, I think, so I feel like at the beginning, so right now we have enough volume where we could get a lot of quantitative data, but initially when we were much smaller, I think we relied on much more, manual interviews with users and try to get them to use the product and understand why they're using or why not they're using. And so I think even if you have like 10 users, just like talking to them has helped us at the very early stages. And then as we get more users, we can rely on more other methods of getting that feedback loop and figure out how to improve retention. So both quantitative and qualitative, but even at this scale, we still want to do a lot of qualitative. So at the early stage, when we didn't have enough users, we just did a ton of interviews. And I think that was pretty helpful, at small scale.
There's one other question for you, Tim. What drove most of your inbound leads? If you could answer quickly.
Sure. It's mostly organic. And I think there's the more users we have, the more word of mouth there is. And also the higher the NPS, the more word of mouth there is. So just going back to like just build a great product, and eventually users actually do come. You can accelerate it, but I think ultimately it has to revolve around building a great product.
Next question. For PLG, what kind of communication works better? Is it explaining the whole solution or use case centric? I'm assuming they're referring to product marketing and communication.
Yeah, so for us, we like to use this framework called jobs to be done, which is when a customer comes to our website, they have a certain job that they're trying to accomplish, and we need to make sure that the messaging they see on their website lines up with that, right? So if a customer comes to our website and has, let's say, a credit card fraud problem, and then we say browser fingerprinting on the website, they may or may not associate those two words together and realize, okay, this is going to solve my problem. So we try to get as close as possible to that actual problem, and then have them realize, oh, okay, this is the technology that will solve that problem, and give them a clear pathway from that point.
Great. The next question is for Ankit Gupta at Quizziz. How do you self-serve a product where the implementer, in your case, teacher, needs to involve other users, the students, because your product is used by two types of personas? So that's the question for you.
Sorry about that. In our case, and Abhishek, you had previously talked about how do you build that simple experience for people to get started. So in our case, definitely the teacher is the initiator, but then finally the students end up being the final consumer of the product. And we also knew that when a teacher uses that product in the classroom, the time is limited, right? So how do you kind of then build an experience where it becomes as frictionless as possible? So initially, and especially for our starting users who have just signed up, we don't push the students to go through the login screen. We kind of build an experience similar to Zoom, right? Like when you get a code and a student can just click on it and join the teacher's session. So again, just reducing those friction steps for that teacher to reach to that aha. And then from there, they are willing to invest more time on the product to unlock the next set of features. So I think that is what we ended up implementing. And then that reduced that friction for the teacher to get in the student also in the on the product.
Great. We probably have time for one quick last question. Would be great if you can share some insights on how you convert freemium users to paid. And if you want to take this.
Is this for me, Abhishek?
Any of you can answer.
Yeah, I mean, again, for us, from a free to freemium was the journey, and we knew what are the painkillers which was still present in the product. And I mean, just identifying that is the most critical part, right? Like, we have, I think, spent a lot of time talking about what are those channels, but probably just figuring out what are the painkillers versus vitamin and putting them behind the paywall probably is the right way to get it there.
Excellent. With that, I think it's time to conclude. That's all we had time for today. We tried to cover as much ground as we could. But the note to the audience: if you have any other questions that remain unanswered, I mean, feel free to reach out to me or any of us, and we'll try to get you a short answer if possible. And couldn't thank you guys enough. Thanks, Dan, Ankit, Sobti, Ankit Gupta, Tim. And Tanmai, he had to jump off slightly early. Thank you so much to you guys. You guys are an inspiration to many founders out there trying to follow the PLG playbook. Really appreciate you taking time. And thanks everyone in the audience for joining a bit late India time and joining a bit too early Pacific time. Thank you so much.